This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Preservation Massachusetts Preservation Conversations. We're just about getting ready to get started. And I guess this is a good time to ask everybody, if you are just joining us, to please mute your phone lines. Due to the number of people we're expecting on the calls, we will not be able to have people speaking throughout the conference, just because it would be a little bit too much. So just a welcome reminder, please mute your phones. Throughout the course of the next hour, if you do have questions, we encourage you to submit them via the little chat feature, which should be available. You should be able to see it. Looks like a little conversation bubble. And throughout the course of the meeting and afterwards, we will be able to save them. We figured out how to do that this time. We'll save your questions for answering at the end, towards the end of our little conversation. And as always, as you probably heard, this conversation is going to be recorded and shared via our YouTube channel and on our website later on today. So this is the third week in a row we've done this, these little preservation conversations, to just connect to people and communicate and share during this time, and just to have some discussion about preservation topics, encourage you to ask some questions, and we'll try to do our best to provide some answers. So today's discussion theme, although it's not the only theme that we'll be discussing or taking questions on, came out of our great conversation we had last week, and it's about building grassroots constituencies and effective local advocacy. And the participants in the conversations today will be our Preservation Massachusetts circuit riders, Jeff Gagne and Stacia Kaplanson, PM's President Jim Igo, and our program assistant, Nick Moore, and I am Associate Director Erin Kelly. And we're also joined again this week by Mass Historical Commission's Chris Skelly, the Director of Local Government Programs. So this is your panel for the next hour, so to speak. So with that being said, the topic today came out of some questions that were asked of Preservation Mass and Chris last week, and it really kind of sparked a thought that all preservation is really local, and having a really strong or good grassroots constituency can often be is often critical for having preservation be supported in your community, or really having a grassroots constituency or really good group is so important, because organizations like Preservation Massachusetts and the Mass Historical Commission, we can only we can be of assistance, and we can do a lot, but really all preservation is local, and it's when the community wants something to happen, or it wants to say that no, this is important, these historic resources are important to us, this is what we how we want preservation to this is why we need preservation, or understanding of preservation in our community. That's why it's important for you and your local community to really, that's really where you shine, and we can be of support. So what we thought we would do today is talk about why building grassroots constituencies is important. Why is it important to do that? And then share some tips on how to build a local constituency if you feel that there isn't one in your community, or how to strengthen one that already exists in your city or town. And then also share some successful examples and models of where we, Preservation Mass circuit riders, and where Chris and others have seen really great examples of effective local advocacy around a certain issue or project. So kind of just to start off, we thought we would try to identify some situations and issues where you would want and or need a good grassroots constituency. So I guess I'll open this up. So Jeff, Stacia, Jim, Chris, whoever wants to start, feel free to take it away.
Okay, well, this is Jeff Gagne. I'm happy to jump in and say a few words, if that would help. I think that as in our work as circuit riders, where we are contacted by preservation advocates from all over the Commonwealth about local issues for the most part. One of the first questions that we ask is, well, who else is involved? And have you spoken with your local historical commission? And I think part of that comes out of the fact that many of the folks who reach out to us are dealing with a sort of emergency situation and are really focused on that particular issue at hand, and sometimes can overlook the importance of, well, if we had a stronger infrastructure, local infrastructure that was involved in supporting preservation, then it wouldn't be just me as an individual or a person or a representative of an organization trying to deal with this issue, but I would have a whole network of local folks whose interests were aligned with mine or my organizations that could be brought to bear on this. And so, you know, and even in cases where, you know, we've had issues brought before us where the end result was not good, we try to create a situation where there's a silver lining from that. Well, you know, we understand that we lost this house, say, but we know that there are future situations where similar losses could happen. How do we build up our local response, our local infrastructure, so that the next time a situation comes up like this, we'll be readier and can respond earlier and more effectively, but also maybe we can use that sort of momentum and that local infrastructure to be more proactive than reactive, and to put systems in place where we can prevent some of these situations from coming up from the start. So that, I think that's, and Stacia can weigh in on this as well, but it is always that balance of, you know, reacting and dealing with the situation at hand, but also thinking more long-term and trying to suggest ways that the local preservation landscape of folks can be stronger and more responsive.
Thanks, Jeff, for starting that off. This is Stacia, and yeah, I guess oftentimes, as you said, we get the call when there is a crisis, and oftentimes I will ask people to take a step back and to think about what they can do within their community to develop what I like to call a culture that values preservation. And it can be hard when you are in a situation where you do need to be reactive to think about being proactive, but being proactive means making an investment in creating that culture. And that can be done in a lot of different ways. But part of that is to find others in your community who are who have common goals, who they may or may not have the title preservationist, but their goal is the same as yours, and to create those alliances, and also to just, as much as possible, encourage your community to look at what are community resources and are special places in their community. And to get back to when Erin mentioned why it oftentimes can be important, is that one of the situations that we often are contacted is when a community is trying to make some decisions about a municipally owned building that either is no longer needed or is underutilized, and that can be a challenging situation, and is a case where if advocates have been proactive and have some supporters in place and have a community that already recognizes that there are places in their community that are important to the community, it can make it easier to move forward in reimagining new uses for those buildings.
Great, thanks, Justin, Stacia. Chris, do you have anything that you want to add? I know there was a lot of, I know this came directly out of the conversation we were having with you last week. So some issues and situations where you, in your role at MHC, really encourage people to try to start building or strengthening grassroots groups.
Sure, I think my least favorite calls to get at the office are those calls when something's imminently threatened, because there's so little that I can do, and there's all the steps that would really be best to have done in the years prior getting those last minute emergency preservation calls are tough to take, because they usually go something along the lines of, well, you can stop this because you're the Massachusetts Historical Commission, right? And I have to give them the bad news that say, no, just because we work in state government doesn't mean we can stop this project from taking place. So I think there's the need for advocacy long term, and certainly there's the need for advocacy in the short term when there's something imminently threatened, because that certainly does kind of galvanize people to really react to something that they can see is about to be lost. But certainly I would much rather see that long-term strategy of advocacy taking place over many years, just slowly building up that constituency so that you've got a lot of the resources at hand, so that you're not having to deal with just be that reactive person where you're always on the defensive when things are threatened. So what are some possibilities that can take place when something is imminently threatened and you don't really have a preservation constituency in front of you ready to back you up? I mean, not all hope is lost. I think it's still worthwhile pursuing trying to save resources at the emergency stage. So I'll often get those calls as well. What I find is that some people will call me and then call me back a few days later, and then the next week and the week after that. But they haven't done what's really important. They're still looking for the state office to try to come in and solve things. And so I kind of recognize when the calls keep coming into me that while I'm happy to answer the specific questions, I often note that they're not doing some of the steps that they need to locally to build up that constituency, because that's what really matters. It's building up your local constituency that's really going to be the only thing that can be effective in a case like that. So one of the things we put together in our office a few years ago was 15 questions to consider when a building is threatened. And one of the things I point out in that is that preservation advocacy is one of the most overlooked strategies, but it's probably the most effective overall. I mean, just having that group of people there in front of you is backing you up is really important. There's times that I wish I could just start singing the song Alice's Restaurant. So if you know that song, Arlo Guthrie talks about 3 people, you're an organization. And then he goes on to 50 people a day, singing a bar to Alice's Restaurant. That's what's effective, coming in with a group of people, whether it's your Board of Selectmen, your Zoning Board of Appeals, whoever you're sort of reaching out to locally. It's not doing that singly as an individual. You've got to have be backed up there with a constituency to do that. So I think if you haven't seen that 15 questions for when a building is threatened, maybe Erin can get that out to everyone that's on the call. And then this past few days, I put together some 15 questions to consider to be an effective preservation advocate. So we can talk about that too. That's sort of just a draft version, but I kind of like to get that out to everybody else that's on the call too, to get your feedback and see what I'm coming up with for some ideas on tips for being an effective advocate as well.
Thank you, Chris. We'll certainly share those the 15 tips for what to do when a property is imminently threatened. And I know speaking on behalf of PM, we get those calls a lot too, and we don't, they're the calls that we are the most difficult, because there's at that point, so little that we can do. I'm going to throw a direct question to our PM President Jim Igo. Before coming to Preservation Massachusetts, Jim was the Executive Director of Preservation Worcester. So talk about local advocacy. He ran a local organization for just about under 10 years. So Jim, do you want to share some perspectives and maybe some suggestions about local constituency building and effective local advocacy from a local level from your own experience in Worcester? I may have to go find and unmute Jim. Where did he go? Okay. Jim, you should be unmuted. Jim, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, how's that? Can you hear me now, Erin?
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I can hear you now. Thanks, Jim.
All right, well, thanks, and thanks for the question. Yeah, it was quite a, it was a long time ago that I was Director of Preservation Worcester, and I took that job over with an organization that was, in some crisis. And a couple of things that I wanted to do immediately was get the word out about who we were, who Preservation Worcester was, and what kinds of things could we do to assist homeowners in the city of Worcester. A lot of us knew a lot of people knew who we were, but a lot of people didn't know who we were. So that was a challenge to get that word out. And one of the ways we did it was we created our Most Endangered program, which we felt was a great way and an inexpensive way to get endangered properties into the newspaper. And it was food for thought for people so that they were subtly educated a little bit about what some of the issues and some of the critical problems were in a city like Worcester. And it actually worked out really well. Another thing that I really tried to do was to get to know the local elected officials, to try to create, again, a little more credibility about what kinds of things Preservation Worcester could do to be helpful, particularly with municipal properties. I think elected officials in the city didn't think very much about the preservation organization back then. I ended up spending more time at the table. Initially, I had to be kind of quiet at the table, but we became more and more involved with different things that went on. And I can remember having Chris come to a Worcester Historical Commission meeting. Again, this is many years ago, but at that time, the Historical Commission really, they had a lot of people who cared and really wanted to do the right thing, but they really didn't know what to do. And Chris spent a fair amount of time working with the Historical Commission of Worcester, which over time developed into a pretty strong resource. So those are some of the few things that we did just to try to make a local organization work a little bit better for the people in the city.
Great, thanks, Jim. Chris, these 15 questions on being an effective preservation advocate. Do you want to walk through those, and maybe we can speak a little bit, because I think they're really really important, because I think a lot of times when people call Preservation Massachusetts, or they call the Mass Historic Commission, or even if they call a local nonprofit, a lot of it is the sense we get is a lot of it they're facing an issue or a crisis, especially if it's around an endangered or threatened resource. You have to come do something. You have to come do something when from our level, we know that it's really not us doing it. The most effective, the best thing to do. You're the one that actually has the power here. So I think people sometimes underestimate their own capability and their own influence and their ability to really change things and make things happen at the local level. So as long as they have understanding their role and the information resources that exist to support them, like our two organizations and a number across the state. Do you want to go through these questions? Because I think it's really important, and I think they're really great, and I think they'll be really helpful to people on this call and all over the state. Do you mind going through that?
Sure. I'm happy to go through them, and I think you're definitely right on the issue there in terms of maybe not underestimating the effectiveness of advocacy. I hear it often that said that, oh, we can't do anything local because we don't have any teeth, and that's just not the case at all. Lots of times the regulatory approach not actually the strongest method of doing things. I mean, actually having a really large constituency, active constituency, may actually be more effective in a lot of cases. So yeah, I think you're right on with that. Okay, so I'll go through my list here of, so it's what I came up with is 15 questions on being an effective preservation advocate. Okay, so everyone can still hear me when I go out onto my other screen here, I hope. Okay. I'm gonna say all 15 of them first, and then maybe we'll go back and start talking about them. So number one is, do I understand the background? Do I understand the decision-making process? Did I or can I participate in the planning process? Am I bringing realistic solutions with me? 5, am I being patient? 6, am I asking questions and listening? 7, am I staying positive, respectful, and enthusiastic? 8, am I seeking common ground? 9, do I understand the need to build a constituency? 10, am I building relationships and bridges? Am I targeting my outreach? 11, 12, am I keeping my message simple? 13, have I formed a preservation organization? 14, can I accept setbacks and move on? And 15, have I thanked others and shared the credit for success? Okay, so would you like me to just go through, Erin, and go through a little more on detail with each of those? All right, well, I'm not sure. Erin, are you there?
Sorry, I was speaking and I was muted. Yes, okay. If you could just go through, and I just wanted everyone to know that we will be sharing these specific questions and responses to them. So if they can't take notes fast enough, don't worry. So just sit back and enjoy. But thanks, Chris.
Okay, so number one is really about understanding the background before you jump right in and start complaining, I guess is what I would say on that. So before you start speaking out about your preservation concern, important to understand all the background and how that situation arose, prior meetings, prior plans, prior decision-making, the bylaws, the ordinances, how state laws work and federal laws work, the different organizations and individuals that have brought the concern to the present day. And you do all this so that you can really have a deep understanding and understand all the players and personalities and interests that are involved. And you're going to be able to sound really intelligent by doing this. And I think one of the problems is when you can kind of come in at the last minute and just say, like, complain to the planning board, how could you have ever let this happen? Or to the Board of Selectmen, I hear this sometimes. How could the town fathers have ever let this happen? And the reality is, of course, the Board of Selectmen may not have any authority themselves. The planning board may have very, very limited authority. And if you understand the background first, it's really recognizing the role of each of those organizations and what their limited role or how they came to the decisions that they did already. So that's a really good idea. And then understanding, number 2, the decision-making process from then on, how things are going to work for us, the step-by-step process, what kind of approvals are still going to be needed for projects, do things still need to go to the historical commission, the planning board, the zoning board of appeals, what kind of public hearings are going to be needed. So understanding what happens into the future through that decision-making process. And then I think 3, in terms of participating in the planning process, is, were you part of the process to develop the master plan, and is what's going on right now meeting the goals of the master plan? And if there's an upcoming plan, making sure that you're part of that discussion, so that your concerns as a local preservationist are going to be included in a master plan or a downtown revitalization plan, economic development plan, housing plan, whatever kind of planning process is going on, so that preservation concerns are addressed in there. And then bringing realistic solutions. Showing up with some realistic goals, ideas, and compromises can go a long ways. So I'd say build your solutions, not your sarcasm. Number 5, being patient. And I'll just say this gently, that preservationists aren't always known for being patient. And I'll say that kind of makes sense that we're not that patient, because when a building's threatened, building that's been there for 200 years could be gone by tomorrow. So we are sort of really recognizing that we gotta work quickly, time's short. But it is really important to try to be patient and recognize that things have gotten to this point, whether it's based on outdated zoning, whether it's based on not having a constituency, not being part of a planning process. All those things have brought you to a point now where it's taken years to get to that point, and you can't necessarily change things just overnight. Am I asking questions and listening? That's really about just trying to hear different viewpoints, recognizing that you're not trying to convince anyone that they're wrong, or that they're wrong and that you're right. It's really all about listening, asking questions, and trying to find out, is there common ground? Is there some place that we can find common ground here? Staying positive, respectful, enthusiastic can be challenging sometimes in preservation with the losses that we see. Yet still really important to try to have some enthusiasm, excitement, energy, be part of that building up of preservation momentum in your community, finding humor along the way. 8, finding common ground. Again, I would say if you're trying to do this, be a preservation advocate by yourself, not very effective. So important to just really be looking for where you can find common ground, even with those that you disagree with. And then number 9, that idea about building a constituency, and to never go to your local officials alone. Always bring a group of preservation constituents with you. And if you don't have a group of preservation constituents to bring with you to a meeting, focus on that before you go to your local elected officials. Focus on building your grassroots preservation constituency first, and only then go to your local officials with your constituency. 10, am I building relationships and bridges? I'd say I like this quote a lot. People support what they help create. So if you can be that bridge that brings together just diverse viewpoints and gives everyone a voice, that's really a good success strategy. Targeting outreach, number 11, trying to really get into everyone else's head. Try to think about every stakeholder out there, and understanding by all the listening and questioning things that you do. Try to really think about, well, what would be a benefit to that organization over there through preservation? What would be a benefit to that organization over there through preservation? And chances are there's some benefit that's out there with preservation for everyone. So targeting that outreach that way is really important. 12, keeping that message simple. Just thinking about, especially for those of us that have done this for a while, preservation terminology and all of the acronyms that we use and terminology, and getting up in front of people and talking about the fabric of that building doesn't always go over so well. So trying to keep your communication simple, plain language, just could be a much better way to communicate. And then the idea of certainly ideally having something like Jim just mentioned about Preservation Worcester, an actual local preservation nonprofit advocacy organization, is ideal. Preservation Worcester has been amazing. They're as Jim mentioned, their endangered program and all the other programs that they have for outreach, really very effective. So we have a few of those in Massachusetts. But even if you just create something like a friends group, sort of a really low budget, low investment friends group to elevate your message, just to try to make it look more official, that you're an official friends group. I find that's really useful. And then 14 is just about accepting some setbacks and moving on, and recognizing that, yeah, we have setbacks, but it's good to just long-term strategies, think long-term, and be far more successful that way. And number 15, about thanking others, sharing the credit for successes. I like this quote too. A person's greatest emotional need is to feel appreciated. And so recognizing the value of every individual that's helped you, even if their contribution was small, certainly very, very effective in just really building that constituency over time. And finding ways to recognize and thank your local politicians, always a really good idea too. Have events and things where you can really have your local local elected officials or state elected officials as well there, and recognizing their role in the preservation successes that you have as well. Really effective, very effective strategies I've seen. So that's the 15, and I think Erin said, we'll find a way to get these out to everyone that's on the call if you'd like to see it.
Thank you very much, Chris. I know it was said a few times that this is a really great resource, and I do think it is common that a lot of what we all hear is we can't do anything, you guys have to come in and do it, where really you are the source of all of the local advocates are really the drivers, and organizations like ours can come in and play a supportive role. But you have a lot more power than you think, and I think don't underestimate the power of local advocacy. Is huge. So we will get this out to everybody and make this available along with Chris's other 15 questions document. Thank you. This is really awesome. So another thing that Preservation Massachusetts has on our website that kind of dovetails would work nicely along with this is in our Action Center, we have something called a roadmap to historic preservation success, which is a little more of a look at kind of the whole process. What it takes. Some general steps towards dealing with a preservation project, whether or not it is a historic resource or project or issue. But that kind of gives you a sense of a roadmap that local advocates could be looking at on the path to preservation success. But you as local representatives and ambassadors for preservation in your communities, there was a lot of really great information that Chris just shared. And I think something that we at Preservation Massachusetts see a lot is and really try to talk about is preservation can't happen in a vacuum. Preservation, these resources have been parts of our community for many years, and finding a reuse for them, their restoration, their next chapter, the next chapter of their lives isn't going to happen just in a vacuum. It can't just be preservationists. So building bridges, looking for local looking for common ground, interested stakeholders. It sounds like a lot of work, but it truly does take a village, and preservation does take a long time. But the more people that come together, the more that they're going to share and celebrate in that success. And when the next challenge or next potential opportunity or project arises, it might be you might find it a little bit easier to tackle, or you kind of know the groups to bring together to affect some sort of change. So so there's been so Jeff, Stacia, Jim, Nick, anything you want to open this up? Anything else you want to talk? Jeff and Stacia, you're working hand in hand with local organizations directly in the field. Anything you want to share about ways that you've encouraged people to strengthen existing groups, or how to keep them going and engaged?
This is Jeff again, just to build on one of Chris's comments and also what Will Tift has submitted in the chat function. I've come across several cases where an issue comes up in a town or a city, and I say, well, have you interacted with the historical commission? And the response I get is, well, there's not anybody on that commission anymore, or I don't believe that the current makeup of the commission is advocating for this issue strongly enough. And my advice is always, well, you get on the commission then. That commission is your local local focus for this work. And if you believe that it's either not functioning fully, or or in some cases, I know there are commissions, and Chris can speak to this as well, where there's simply not enough people, or there are not people on them to keep them functioning. So I've often suggested that, well, you get on the commission and you recruit the people to sit on the commission with you to the extent that you can, that can be effective and rebuild that constituency. And it sounds like Will's comment from Marion is that they've been working on that, which is excellent. And you know, it's the power is there to be had, and it's if you put yourself in that position of having that power and that influence, then that's a great way to again help build an infrastructure that can respond to lots of situations over a time, and not just a particular emergency situation that might come up.
And I wanted to share a few examples of things I've seen local commissions do that I think also are proactive as opposed to reactive. There's a local commission here in Central Mass who at a community event, an annual fair that happens on the town common, has a table, and they're there along with all of the other community organizations to talk about what does who is the historical commission, what do they do. So I think oftentimes citizens within the community may or may not even know that there is a historical commission, or what's the difference between the commission and the society. And so by having a presence at a community event, you're able to connect with people in your community who may want to serve on the commission. Another example of reaching out to your community, a community in Western Mass that I know reached out and did a community-wide survey, and was really creative about reaching out to people, calling people, offering prizes for people who were willing to participate. The commission was looking for feedback from their community as far as what are the important places in this community, that information that was gathered, there was a hope that it would help to be able to guide decisions in the future, and that it is part of that planning process. And the last thing I wanted to share is, commissions who are active and regularly on an annual or however it works for them, meet with other boards within their town government, do a presentation to the select board, so that you are working on letting others within your community know what your commission is doing, and also building some of those bridges that may be helpful down the road.
Great, thank you very much, Stacia. I think Chris, you touched on this a little bit before, but another thing just to kind of reinforce that a lot of time the face for preservation in our communities, if there isn't a local nonprofit organization like there exists in Worcester, Boston, Dartmouth, New Bedford, Springfield. A lot of times the Historic Commission is seen to be the face of preservation is the face or the representative of the preservation in the community. And I think I know I've heard Chris say a number of times that sometimes the regulatory avenue isn't always the most effective way to go. And Chris, you have a great the comparison between the land trust, the land trust organization, the land trust movement, and historic preservation, and the two different routes they tried to take. Do you want to go into that a little bit more, and how sometimes how even just having an informal friends group can be just as can be very effective, even if there is no regulatory authority behind them?
Sure, I love talking about that. Yeah, so I can't take credit for the Land Trust Historical Commission comparison, but I've definitely picked up on it and used it in a bunch of presentations since I first heard it. I often look over at the land trust, land conservation community with some envy, just because I see these land trusts across the state that are so effective in their land protection conservation strategies. And then I look over at the historic preservation side of things and see that even though we've been effective, we headed down a different road than land protection, in my view. So we basically, local historical commissions were basically all established across the state, mostly in the 60s and 70s, especially around the bicentennial time. So we headed down, in terms of local historic preservation, we headed down the road of doing historic preservation through local government, through an official town board of a local historical commission. That has some advantages, but it has a lot of disadvantages as well. Whereas the land protection community really headed down the road of, okay, yeah, we're going to have a conservation commission that's going to be responsible for the Wetlands Protection Act and some open space issues as well. But we're really going to focus a lot more on actual private nonprofit organizations, land trusts. And so there's hundreds of land trusts across the state, at least local land trusts. And they're very, very effective at doing a lot of the things that historical commissions just aren't set up to do. It's not that the individuals aren't capable of doing that, it's just that they're not quite set up well as being part of municipal government, not set up well to do that kind of thing. So in terms of working directly with property owners, land trusts can do that, but historical commissions not very well. Social, educational things like hiking tours or local food kind of events, wine and cheese parties, all those kinds of things that land trusts do all the time, and really bring out all this just great local excitement and enthusiasm around land protection. Well, we don't do that so well as a historical commission because we're part of town government. It would be like the conservation commission. It'd be like the conservation commission trying to hold a wine and cheese party. I mean, you'd laugh at that. That would be ridiculous. So I'm a big fan of really trying to encourage lots more of local nonprofit historic preservation organizations across the state, whether it is a formal nonprofit or whether it's something less formal like a friends organization, but trying to do something else besides just doing historic preservation within municipal government. I mean, you're limited to 3 to 7 members on your local historical commission, and you're appointed by the Board of Selectmen. You're subject to the open meeting law. You have all kinds of limits, and fundraising can't really be done as a municipal board either. Whereas all those things are possibilities in terms of a friends organization or a nonprofit organization at the local level. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I've been contacting lots of local commissions in the past month or so to get updates in terms of their members that are on the local commissions. And I also use that as a chance to figure out who's active as a local commission. We have probably at least 50 commissions in Massachusetts that are inactive. And a lot of those are in small towns, but not all of them. And although it would be good to say, yes, we definitely need a local historical commission in every community, maybe it's even more important to have some sort of an organization, a nonprofit friends group in those communities, so that there is a voice, an official voice for historic preservation somewhere. I really like the idea of having the private organizations, because instead of the 3 to 7 members on a local commission, now you could have 100 members or 200 members or 500 members that are all members, and potentially you're just building a much bigger constituency when you have a nonprofit organization that way. All right, I'll leave it at that.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much. And I think a good example of, and not saying that, I think a really great example of how, you have a regulatory, a government regulatory body and, a nonprofit working together is really exemplified by like Preservation Massachusetts and the Mass Historical Commission. Mass Historical Commission and Chris, they're, state government, they have regulatory authority, they can do things that they have, obligations and can do things that Preservation Massachusetts can't, but we can also we can do things that they necessarily can't. So it's kind of like a really great mutual relationship. We support each other, and working together, preservation is that much stronger. So I think that's a really good thing to think about, in support of each other. So I've just put up on the screen just some online resources for some examples that Preservation Mass staff had come up with for examples of communities that have done really good, effective local advocacy. Stacia had wanted to share some examples, and some of these are actually were presentations that were made at statewide historic preservation conferences, which the presentations are all archived on our website. The links are there, but you can also go onto our website and go to the statewide preservation conference page and find those there. And also another way, resources to strengthen local effective advocacy is the Massachusetts Preservation Listserve that Chris oversees. That's a really great resource to get examples of how other communities have dealt with issues, or found good ways, or good good tips on trying to strengthen preservation in your own community. So we're going to go on to some questions. Oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. Oops. We're going to go into some questions, specifically some questions that had been submitted prior to this call. I think the one question that came in, we did have one from Will Tips, but we did have one that came in last week after our previous preservation conversation. So this one is from the town of Orleans, which is in the process of trying to establish an architecture conservation district. It said certain projects would require an application to a historic district commission. Can you explain the pros and cons of the current historic commission taking double duty of being a historic district commission as well? Not sure if that one would be best directed to Chris or Jeff or Stacia. Chris, that might be more up your alley.
Sure. I think I understood it, but could you summarize it again?
Sure. Basically, the town of Orleans is trying to establish an architectural conservation district, and in that, certain projects would require an application to a historic district commission, which I'm assuming the town does not have currently. They want to know the pros and cons of having their current historic commission also act as a historic district commission.
All right. This sounds like a at least 10-minute question, so I'm not sure if I should really take up the whole time answering this. So maybe I should.
Okay.
Maybe somehow I should get back to them that way.
Okay, I can forward I can forward it directly to you if you want. This person actually said that they called you about this, and but they had missed connecting with you. So Joan from Orleans, I'm going to forward this question on to Chris because I think it would be a little pretty involved. So Chris, I'll forward this to you via email as soon as we get off. Okay. All right. So going in. Okay. Let's see. Another question that came in from Littleton. They're looking. The town of Littleton is interested in hearing some ideas that would be good to include in a public meeting. The town has recently purchased a circa 1750 house near the Common, and they're currently trying to decide what to do with it. They want to have a public meeting to garner ideas and see what the town would support. They're wondering what they should include in that meeting and how to get people interested in the property and its outcome. So if anybody has any questions, I think we can, oops, sorry. Keep doing that. I guess we can open this up to everybody. Any suggestions on how to structure this public meeting to get to see what the town would support for this particular property and what sort of ideas they would encourage. So, Jeff, Stacia, Jim, Chris.
Well, this is Jeff here. It's interesting that this question came up because we've been dealing with a fair amount of this recently. A fair amount of similar situations where in order to preserve a property, a town has acquired this historic structure without a plan for using it, preserving it, or even maintaining it. And suddenly they have this new responsibility, not only of dealing with the project's physical upkeep, but also figuring out what a new use will be that the town will support. And I think one thing that I've found in my own personal years of being a community organizer and activist around historic preservation is that people love information and historic photos. And even if a focus of a significant focus of a community meeting like that is just about history and engaging people with why the property is important and kind of getting their buy-in as to why it should be preserved and adaptively reused in some way. So just presenting solid, compelling information, I think, is one of the first steps. And a second recommendation I would like is to not just have it be a sort of free-for-all discussion, that you really try to focus the conversation by coming with either specifically prepared questions that you want to have answered, even if it's just a few, 4 or 5 questions, to really keep folks focused on the information that you're trying to get. And that can be interactive. You can have boards where people stick stickers on them to kind of vote in real time over what they think is important or what options that they would most support. But really, again, not having the session be a free-for-all, but really making sure that you set it up so that you get the feedback and information that you're really looking for would be a sort of broad brush recommendation that I would have.
And this is Stacia. I think I'd also encourage you to make, if at all possible, make this information available to people who aren't able to attend the meeting. So, utilizing using cable access, virtual, having it available virtually in real time or after the meeting, so that more people can have access to the information. And then also, if at all possible, have a way that people can also weigh in on and answer those questions, SurveyMonkey or some other way to get as broad a constituency of interested parties involved.
That's a great point, Stacia. And I was just thinking of a conversation we were having recently about a town that purchased a property on which there's this amazing, enormous barn, which was really the reason why they were so interested in saving the house and the barn together. But one of the things that we talked a lot about is, well, what are similar examples of successful projects involving a similar resource that can be brought to bear and shown to people? And if you could come into a meeting having done a fair amount of outreach to go try to look at similar situations and projects around the Commonwealth that have been particularly successful, I think that that's often very helpful to show to people, because part of the challenge is realizing that a lot of people may not have the ability to come up with a vision. They need you to provide examples of a vision for them, and that stimulates their own thinking. And rather than from starting from scratch in their own internal planning in their mind, to really say, well, here's 6 other properties from around the Commonwealth where people have been really creative and have reused this site and it's been successful, and put those options on your list of things to consider in terms of uses or approaches for preserving the site.
Great, Jeff and Stacia. That's thank you so very much for those. That's great information for Littleton. And if you're looking for examples, another great place to ask is obviously the Listserve. We've often found that people are more than willing to share if they have if they've undergone a similar project that has been successful, or they're oftentimes willing to share and give of their own experience and advice. And also in our Action Center, we've been trying to create reuse examples by building types. So if you go to our Action Center, you can see examples of links to examples of successful projects that have involved whether it's barns or churches. So the more, like Jeff said, if you can come and show similar examples of a successful project, it really, because not everybody can look at a building that is in severe disrepair and see the potential there. So sometimes you kind of have to fill in the blanks right there. Again, how can we find out a preservation successes? It's difficult to do. We know that they're out there, and preservation maps, we try to cobble as many as we can. One thing that we've begun doing is trying to share the success stories of local communities through our Storyteller series. Storytellers is it's a bi-monthly email that Preservation Massachusetts sends out that really, we don't write it. We see if it's basically a local organization telling about their preservation project or challenge or success. A recent one was the David and Abigail Tilden House in Canton. The Canton Historical Society filled it out. So we've tried to collect information that way, but also the Listserve is a great place to go to. We try to mine our circuit riders' brains every now and then and put those things in our action center, but we're always constantly trying to get as many examples as we can of successful projects, and also put them in one place so you have a central place you can go to try to find that. So that's an ongoing issue. Now we're kind of running out of time. One more question. Do you have any examples of incentives towns can offer to encourage owners of older homes to preserve them? I think we touched a little bit on this last week. There was a question about, I think, local tax abatements, but Jeff, Stacia, Chris, any examples that you know of communities that have encouraged owners of older homes to preserve them? Unfortunately, you know, from a statewide perspective, when owners of historic homes call us and say, I want to do right by my house, are there resources or funds for me? Unfortunately, there, you know, we have to say there really isn't anything, you know, at the statewide level. There is no statewide homeowner historic tax credit as there are in a few other states. So it's oftentimes the hardest, one of the hardest things we have to talk about when we have someone who knows they want to do right by their building, but we really can't assist them too much. But Jeff, Stacia, Chris, have you heard of any town-specific programs that have tried to encourage or assist owners of older historic homes?
It doesn't really address the financial issue, which I know is a real challenge, but I think that there's been success with local organizations giving awards. I think of the Springfield Preservation Trust, who every year have a preservation awards ceremony in May and recognize homeowners who have done the right thing, whether it's long-term folks who are long-term stewards of properties, new properties that have been rehabilitated and reused. It's not the same as giving somebody a check, but I think it goes along with what Chris said of saying thank you to the people in your community who are doing the right thing. And it's a small thing, but I think it does matter.
Stacia, I was going to say the same exact thing, that the financial side is the hard side, but those local programs like award programs or even a house marker program that just, you know, begins to kind of lay the groundwork for education and recognizing, you know, architecturally or historically significant buildings and putting examples of good stewardship at the forefront and recognizing them, I think really, you know, can be helpful just again of building that culture of preservation in a town. But it is, the money is the hard part. It's tough. So we recognize that too, and we get a fair amount of calls regarding it.
Yeah. Those are great examples. Thank you, Jeff and Stacia. I think, you know, just, you know, acknowledging, it's kind of like what we have to keep doing these days, acknowledging the small wins and celebrating every, you know, every little baby step forward, because even if it's a little step forward, it's a step forward in the right direction. That is great. Thank you so very much. And we're just hitting 11 o'clock, so we've kind of reached the end of our hour. I think we got all of the questions. If anyone had a question that didn't get answered, well, I think we did address, Will Tips, I think we did address your question, but if you wanted, if you still had some specific, you know, specific things you wanted, please feel free to email me or Chris. Both of our emails are up on this slide, my email and Chris's email. And we just want to thank you again for attending. Again, this is going to be posted to our YouTube channel and our website later on today. We're going to do this again next Wednesday. We had some ideas that were shared last week of some future topics, but if anyone else has any ideas for discussion topics you'd like us to tackle during preservation conversations, or other questions that all of a sudden come to you in a couple of hours, please feel free, to email them to me or Chris, and we'll try to include them in our discussion next week. Or if we don't know the answer, try to get you in touch with the person who can answer your question. So once again, keep doing that. Thank you so very much for listening into our preservation conversation, and also a huge thank you again for being great, such supportive and wonderful ambassadors for historic preservation in your community and in Massachusetts, because our work, Preservation Massachusetts, would be impossible if it wasn't for you. We can't work without you. So thank you all for attending. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Jeff, Stacia, Jim, Chris, thank you all so very much. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy. We will see you back here next week. Have a great day. All right.